Lawyers, how does it feel to defend a client who is actually guilty? As a defense attorney in the United States, it feels great. Why? Often, you are not really certain. Many cases are built on slim circumstantial evidence. I always give my clients the benefit of a doubt when they say, and most do, that they are innocent. I have had countless cases where it became obvious later in the case that my seemingly guilty client was, in fact, innocent all along. So I diligently investigate every claim my client makes, no matter how far-fetched it may seem from a cynical perspective. A justice system usually works, but it takes dedicated defense lawyers to keep zealous prosecutors from convicting the innocent. Unless you're representing somebody who is a sociopath or has a violent streak, most people become criminal defendants because they are down on their luck and have become really desperate. I have no problem feeling compassion for somebody who has been less fortunate than me. And if that's not the story, then they're usually just stupid people who screwed up. Giving them a break seems fair to me, except for the serial offenders who just never learn. I never feel bad for them. Although I agree that there is a problem with repeat offenders and criminals not getting caught. Once somebody has been caught, contrary to popular belief, the law frequently comes down on them like a ton of bricks, even for relatively harmless offenses. For the truly and obviously guilty, I think of my job as making sure that they are not punished any more severely than they deserved. I don't believe that it's fair to ruin somebody's life and often the lives of their children and others close to them because of a quote-unquote victimless crime or a minor property crime. Plus, doing so usually makes them even more of a burden on society. A huge percentage of cases are substance offenses. As a matter of principle, I have never believed that people should be punished for substance misuse, especially when the main difference between the poor and others is whether they can afford to get their buzz prescribed. I also believe that our laws are a huge waste of resources and that the punishments are insanely disproportionate to the punishments for crimes that are far more heinous. Bottom line, the war on substances is BS and it's incredibly destructive BS. On most of my cases, I feel like I'm doing God's work. I'm not a cop basher. I support the police overall and I'm grateful for everything they do. But cops lie a lot. Even when I know my client is guilty, it still angers me off to see a cop blatantly lie about something I know to be untrue. A big part of my job is making sure that ethical lines aren't crossed by the good guys. Due to my personal values, I don't represent people in violent crimes or other offenses. I am strongly judgmental to the point of being vindictive towards people who deliberately cause serious injury to another person, so I just can't do that because my heart's not in it. Also, the evidence in those cases is usually stronger than in other types of cases, so the odds are even more stacked against winning the case, and I hate to lose. I have had very few clients that I consider to be bad people, so at the end of the day, I'm helping somebody. I find that incredibly rewarding. I also do my best to give advice and counsel them towards not repeating the mistakes that got them in trouble. Although not always successful, I think I am actually pretty good at that, so I feel like I'm doing good for society as well as my client. Big picture, I serve as a cornerstone of our country's values. Without defense attorneys, our rights would mean crap. I not only make sure that laws are enforced properly, I actually enforce the most important law we have, the Constitution. I make no apologies for that ever. Right, he's the Robin Hood of the courtroom, stealing justice from the wealthy and powerful and giving it to the downtrodden and misunderstood. Story 2. I'm an attorney who does some criminal defense. On several occasions, I have convinced the DA that my client was innocent and gotten the charges dropped before trial. On several other occasions, I have convinced the DA that their evidence was spotty enough that beyond a reasonable doubt would be hard to achieve, and they have offered me things like dropping the charges if my client pays court costs, which the client usually takes since a few $100 for 0% chance of conviction is better than rolling the dice on a jury and cheaper than paying your lawyer for the trial if you aren't indigent. In still other situations, I have convinced the DA that although my client is probably guilty, the culpability isn't really there to justify these charges, like it's technically a violation, but not really under the spirit of the law, or it's technically a serious crime, but this is not a person who should be barred from many jobs, from voting, from owning weapons, etc. Note, when I say convince, I don't mean sweet-talking or whatever. There's some room for advocacy, obviously, but you need a basis to work from. Like for a DUI for psych medicines, I'll bring the prescriptions and the FDA-approved ppm ranges and say, yeah, the sample work was above the therapeutic range, but not by that much. Certainly below the toxic range, and this prescription is only 4 months old. Got the guy a break for taking a bit too much of his one new med. It's not like he had a wreck or hurt anyone. You have definitely scared him into being more careful. Often this will at least get a serious crime dropped to a misdemeanor or let them plead to one of 3 charges with the others dismissed, or even a small favor like let them plead guilty but get the weapon back that was confiscated during their arrest. All of which is to say, DAs typically do not prosecute someone they think is innocent. They have a different job from pretty much every other kind of attorney. Most attorneys zealously advocate for a position. DAs zealously advocate enforcement of the law, which requires releasing innocent people just as much, more in fact, as jailing guilty ones. Granted, some DAs forget this sometimes, but they are in the exception in my experience. Note that most lawyers cite My Cousin Vinny as the most accurate Hollywood representation of trial litigation. In that film, after the defense presents new slam dunk evidence of innocence, we don't wait for a dramatic jury verdict like most movies. The DA drops the charges after consulting his officer and his expert to verify the accuracy of the testimony. This is what would really happen. Story 3. It doesn't really work that way outside of TV and movies. Just because a prosecutor thinks your guy did something doesn't make it so. You can suspect something, but a suspicion doesn't make you actually guilty. How do you know he's guilty? You're the lawyer, not the jury. It's the jury's job to find the defendant guilty or not guilty. It's your job to make sure that the process of determining guilt was properly done. If the guy is truly guilty as sin, then the government should have no problem proving it. You're there to make sure they follow the rules when proving their case. Let's take a few popular examples. He confessed. Okay, let's find out about that. He confessed when he was interrogated for 18 hours without food, water, bathroom breaks, or sleep. Or he was threatened with a weapon, or knocked around by a cop, or he was big-talking to a cellmate in order to not get picked on while he was in holding. Or it was a jailhouse informant who got a lighter sentence if he said your guy confessed. Of course, there's no audio. Or there is a 2-second audio clip where he said, I did it. They didn't provide the 2-hour conversation leading up to that, so you have no context. Confessions aren't as great as everyone says. If anyone tells you that I would never confess to something I didn't do, think about how that would change if they were being threatened and tortured. They'd probably break in an hour. Everybody knows he did it. This is one of the most popular and the scariest. Rumors can't convict people. Rumors aren't evidence. Just because a guy is a schmuck doesn't mean he committed a crime. Just because he committed a crime in the past doesn't mean he committed this crime. And just because he's of a particular religion, skin color, part of town, etc., doesn't mean he's guilty. Assumptions are not evidence. There is an eyewitness. Google eyewitness reliability. Memories are fallible. Eyewitnesses get it wrong. It's pretty scary how off they can be, especially if stressed. Okay, let's switch gears and assume your client did exactly what the government said he did, and that's a stretch. The government will usually overcharge. You still have a few options. You can go through the process and make sure the government followed the rules along the way. You have to make sure the government actually has admissible evidence to back it up, and that the evidence is reliable and was lawfully collected. You cannot take government officials, prosecutors, police, etc. at their word. They can get things wrong, be overzealous in trying to solve a case, and some can outright lie to get someone they know is guilty. For example, take a financial crime. How do you know that the document the government entered into evidence actually says what they say it says? Can you read it? Where did they get it? Do the numbers add up? Let's suppose the government followed the rules and the evidence is solid. Even if your guy did it, was he set up? Did he understand his role in the situation? Did an overzealous police force trick or coerce him into doing it? Did the defendant try to get out of it before the sting? Did the government force him back into the sting? Okay, so the government did everything correctly. Your guy did it. Your other option is that you complete out to your client. You have to make sure that the punishment is fair and reasonable. Do you trust the government to met out punishments all by itself? That's a lot of power to give to the government. You can try to argue that a lesser punishment is just a benefit to society, etc. Was there a mitigating circumstance? Do you trust the government who just spent a ton of money convicting you to be fair when sentencing you? That's a lot of trust to put into a public official. So yes, if the guy did it, you still have to do your job. If you don't, you'll wind up in a situation where you're jailed because everyone knows you did something. The government didn't have to prove it. You're just convicted. No one was there to fight for you. Story 4. Defense lawyers play a crucial part in ensuring justice is done. Let's say an appalling crime is committed and an innocent person is arrested and seen as the main suspect. There would be a media whirlwind and many people would react emotionally and think along the lines of, this schmuck doesn't deserve a good lawyer. Give him some loser and let the judge and jury crucify him. But then the conviction is worth nothing. Only when a criminal has had every chance and his case has been scrutinized from every angle by a good defense can society be confident in the conviction and that the punishment is just. Story 5. I'm a public defender. I'd say most of my clients are guilty of what they were arrested for. My job isn't necessarily to get someone acquitted if they are actually guilty. It's to provide their constitutionally guaranteed right to counsel, protect their other rights, and act as a check against the prosecutors and police. I'm supposed to work for the best possible outcome for my client, and 95% of the time, this means getting them the best deal I can and making sure the prosecutor is doing their job. How does it feel to represent a guilty client? Well, I have moral objections to substance laws and serious issues with the way they and many other laws are disproportionately enforced against people of color. When my clients are there for substances or loitering or trespassing, because they were black and at a park after dark, I rage internally at the BS. It is an infrequent occurrence that a true sociopath that simply loves committing crime comes across my desk. Most of my clients are there ultimately because they are poor and black or brown. That's why I got into this business in the first place. So generally, I feel A-okay representing a guilty client. So basically, he's a legal fixer, but for the little guy. He's the one who makes sure the system doesn't completely screw them over. Story 6. Lawyer here. It's my freaking honor to do so. I'm not defending the person, I'm defending the Constitution. When I get in the courtroom, I see it as a clash between hundreds of years of political history in a microcosmic instance. You want my client to explain himself? Too bad. James Madison said no. You think he did it but aren't sure? Our founding fathers specifically wanted you to find him not guilty. I'm no magician. I'm a guy standing between the states, putting a citizen in jail. If the state would just do its job, investigate its witnesses, and put on a somewhat competent case, they'll probably win. But you would not believe how often that doesn't happen. Every bit of government incompetence that you see in stark relief when you go to the DMV or the post office also shows up in police departments and prosecutor offices. That, plus there is often a hierarchy, so low-level prosecutors don't have the discretion to dismiss cases they should. As a prosecutor, I had real joy prosecuting the bad guys, but thank God there are not nearly as many real criminals in the world as there are dumb kids who smoke and shoplift. And when you switch to the defense side, you see so much incompetence at prosecutors' offices that most never want to go back. Story 7. I'm not a lawyer, but I know plenty of lawyers and have actually asked this question before. Even if they are guilty, lawyers are just providing a service. Everyone deserves a fair trial, and lawyers are just doing their job. That's the mindset I've heard the most. You just have to do your best and believe that the client is innocent until proven otherwise. And even if you know they are guilty, how you feel about your clients should not affect your performance. There are also a lot of people that think lawyers that defend criminals are immoral. Most of them are not. They're just doing a job that is necessary in society. I'm a street worker, and I guess it is kind of similar when my clients are married men, which most of them are. I used to feel bad, but really I'm just providing a service. I'm not the one that is breaking my marriage vows, and if I didn't provide this service, then there would be someone else. Story 8. My job isn't to walk guilty clients, but rather to make sure the police and prosecutors have done their jobs properly, and if my client pleads or is convicted of any criminal conduct, it's for conduct he or she actually did. Also, more often than not, my role is one of mitigation, in that I know I cannot beat the case against my client outright, but I want to give my client the best possible offer. Police often bend the rules by conducting illegal searches, fabricating probable cause, etc. And prosecutors often do the same by not turning over exculpatory evidence, so it is my job to make sure every player in the system does their job by the book. Judges in most jurisdictions are almost always former prosecutors, and they will do things that shock the conscience to help the prosecution. Often I have to appeal verdicts or file writs to remedy judicial action that is clearly biased and violates the constitutional rights of my client. It isn't my job to judge my clients. Rather, I liken my job to that of a triage surgeon who has to objectively look at the facts of the case and see where I can stop it, so to speak. At the end of the day, everyone deserves a defense. If I were to start picking and choosing what cases I will defend, I'm not living up to my obligation to uphold the Constitution and the rights and protections it affords. Those who are accused of the most abhorrent conduct are the people who need to be defended most to ensure that both their and society's constitutional rights are upheld and protected from being slowly eroded by overreaching governmental action. It's very easy to not care about people who have been accused of repugnant crimes, but if we stop defending them, who will be forgotten next? Personally, I feel that the government is an oppressor, and criminal defense attorneys provide a crucial check on governmental authority and action. I like to think that we're on the front lines, fighting in the trenches of an ongoing war against our constitutional rights. Story 9. I'll never forget this one client I had, real piece of crap, but hey, it's my job to make sure he gets the fair treatment the justice system requires, right? So this guy was up for a long string of charges. I can't go into exact detail because he's still on appeal. Being an attorney for guys like this is tough because you don't necessarily want to just throw your client to the dogs, but you also have an innate sense of morality. Luckily, I was a mid-level defense attorney, so I was able to strike a sort of balance, at least as was justifiable to me, when it came to looking at myself in the mirror and sleeping soundly at night. This particular client never actually admitted guilt, but anyone with common sense knew that he was all but standing trial before a jury of 12 eyewitnesses. Still, the justice system and due process demand they be proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and it was my job to scrounge up what reasonable doubt I could find for my mid-level defense attorney salary. I was not, nor am currently, even a junior partner in my firm, so I had little reason to go above and beyond for any of my clients, let alone a piece of crap like this guy. But I wasn't exactly about to toss an alley-oop to the prosecutors either. So the first day of trial comes, and at this point, we've been through multiple plea bargains that our client has refused. This guy was adamant that he was not guilty, and I wasn't exactly in the position to tip my hand and let him know that he was pretty screwed. When you're just another lawyer cog in the firm's wheel, you know what that's like. I tried a number of tactics and angles to get the guy to take a plea bargain, but he always refused. We actually had a fairly sweet deal at one point, but this guy was just that much of a schmuck that he would rather go the entire distance with his not guilty plea and lose and spend 20 plus years in jail than bargain with the ADA. I don't think I'll ever understand his rationale. So of course the ADA brings out her A material during the opening statement, but she went far beyond even what I expected her to do in the opening salvo. And this was after 7 years of trial experience, including my public defender tenure. I'd never seen this kind of dreaming, even in TV shows. Judge Judy would have been in awe at this speech. Once she finished, I asked if we could recess briefly. I don't know if the judge was as blown away as I was or what, or maybe he just knew what I was trying to do, but he allowed it. I took my client into a side room and begged him to take a plea deal. Apparently, this ADA's opening argument had gone to him as well because he was very willing to accept, which was shocking considering his vehemence leading up to the trial and his attitude through the multiple plea bargains offered before. So the ADA, myself, and the judge met in the judge's chambers to speak about the possibility of a renewed plea bargain. Obviously, the ADA had the upper hand since it had gotten to this point, and she had just given a speech that the best writers in Hollywood would love to hear, but anything was better than the 3-week trial and 20-plus year sentence my client was facing. For everyone involved, really. So the ADA was sitting there looking rather smug, and I felt the judge also understood the upper hand she had, but she still left it up to me to start the negotiation. She asked me what my client and I wanted. I said, about $350. It was about that time that she noticed that I was about 8 stories tall and was a crustacean from the Proterozoic era. She said, damn it, monster, get out of my damn courtroom. They ended up taking the plea anyway, and my client got 8 years plus 10 probation. Story 10. I'm an attorney, but not the criminal kind. I do evictions. Luckily, over 90% of the time, I know the person has breached the lease and has been given multiple chances to fix the problem. However, there have been a handful of cases where I knew my client, the landlord, was being completely unfair about the situation and wouldn't budge on kicking them out. Times like that make the duty of loyalty awful. At least he's not a tax lawyer. Those guys have to defend real monsters. Story 11. Guilty clients never make you nervous, but innocent clients keep you up at night, and endlessly so. When one of my clients is guilty, or at least appears to me to be guilty, it doesn't affect my feelings of the case at all. You have to take each case as it comes and decide the best course of action for your client as the case progresses. It's not an outrageous statement to acknowledge that statistically, most people charged with criminal offenses are technically guilty of some offense. Something led to the cops being called, and the state is filing charges based on the officer's word. Many times the state is wrong. Many times they overcharge the crime for leverage later. Many times the cops are wrong. Many times it's just a misunderstanding. All this happens frequently, and many times the client is totally innocent, but this is not the majority of cases. It is arguable whether most or merely many charges should be brought at all, looking at you, prohibition, but that's a different conversation. We're there to protect our clients' rights and to achieve the best possible outcome, even if all the potential outcomes are pretty awful. To your question, though, I presume you're worried about the guilty person going free scenario. In a perfect world, you wouldn't need to worry about it because the system would be flawless. If someone wasn't convicted, it would mean the state didn't have enough evidence, and since it is better for a guilty man to go free than an innocent man to go to jail, then the outcome was a victory for the rights of the individual. We all win. Since our current system has become dramatically weighted against the individual, defendants, if a quote-unquote guilty person avoids conviction, The reaction is even more dramatic. You treat it as a miracle. For every one client that does avoid conviction, there are scores who do not. The last thing we have in the US is a guilty person going free problem. And don't let talking heads or tough on crime politicians try to tell you otherwise without evidence. Sometimes what a client does bothers you, but you develop a thick skin pretty quickly. After enough cases, you're so used to seeing your clients as more than the worst thing they ever did that you see them as a victim of one thing or another. Aside from the occasional schmucks, it's not like schmucks don't get arrested. Poverty, class pressures, violent environments, you name it. They're just like us, and it's not like we're anything special. They go get groceries, have a family of one sort or another. They watch movies. The only difference is that some stuff went bad for them and now they're cleaning up the pieces. It happens. What's infuriating is when the state gathers evidence in violation of your client's 4th, 5th, or 6th Amendment rights. Guilty or innocent, it drives every defense attorney, or at least most, up the wall. Those principles protect all of us, and to see them tossed aside so casually because he's guilty anyway, as many in the system view it, is just abhorrent. When these issues pop up, it doesn't matter what your client did, you want to fight it aggressively, and I take it very personally. The innocent clients, though, sometimes you just want to cry at how broken everything is. And if you're learning a thing or two from the video so far, please don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. Story 12. Just fine. My job isn't to make sure that innocent people aren't convicted, it's to make sure the state follows the rule of law. Now, I love nothing more than helping an innocent person beat a charge, but innocence or guilt is not really the purpose. If the state can't follow the rules, why should my client or anyone else? The state has all the power and money and many times set up the rules in the first place. Why shouldn't they have the burden of following those rules? This only applies to criminal law. Civil law is different, and many times if you are on the defensive, you are trying to limit the fallout to your client to the best of your legal abilities. But there's a reason I focus on plaintiff's side work in criminal defense over civil defense or prosecution. Story 13. I've always said that I honestly believe it would be emotionally harder to be a prosecutor than a defense attorney. My job is simple. I always represent my clients to the best of my ability. It's not my job to win a case. It's the prosecutor's job to prove my client guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. If a guilty client of mine walks, it's because the prosecutor could not or did not do their job of proving him or her guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Plus, I love that my job matters. My representation of a person could determine if they go home and have dinner with their family or spend the rest of their life behind bars. The prosecutor, on the other hand, has to decide what crimes to charge a person with, what offers to make to resolve a case, and what cases to proceed to trial with. If an innocent person goes to prison, that's because a prosecutor made a mistake in pursuing those charges. I think that would be a lot harder to sleep with. Story 14. I'm not a lawyer, but here's what I hope the answers generally are. It feels good. I'm the best and strongest check against abuses of state power, and if the Bill of Rights is a shield, I'm the one actually holding it for you. That last part is totally optional, but I'll allow it. Thanks, CDLs, even you slimy ones I wouldn't touch with penicillin gloves. Story 15. I interviewed for a job as a public defender. One of the questions was, how would you react if after you got a guy off for mistreatment, he admitted to you that he did it? The answer was you couldn't do anything because of attorney-client privilege unless you knew another crime was imminent, which from the fact pattern it wasn't. In any case, she was like, you're going to see stuff like that all the time. How will you sleep? I think most do it either by not caring or by looking at it as necessary for the system to function as a whole. Yes, rigorous defense of criminals will ensure some guilty people go free, but it will also ensure some truly innocent people do as well. Story 16. Really, as a lawyer, you believe in the justice system and you want it to work properly for the benefit of society. As such, in criminal proceedings, you know the importance of innocence before being proven guilty. You know that you would prefer a guilty man go free than an innocent man be wrongfully convicted. That said, at least in my jurisdiction, you have a buffer where if someone admits to you that they did it, you can't represent them in telling the court they did not do the actions they are accused of. You can only try to put the prosecution to proof, essentially to pick holes in the case they establish. You can't lie to the court. The issue comes about when you know they are guilty but they won't admit it to you. Usually, though, you know based on the brief of evidence and you know that them pleading not guilty will essentially mean a harsher sentence. No sentence discount for an early guilty plea. That said, lawyers are human and we have less rational components of your psyche. I'm not the right person for the job if my emotional side kicks in and I feel personal anger towards my client. For me, this has happened where a kitty fiddler wants to plead not guilty when clearly, on the evidence, guilty, thereby dragging the victim through at least one terrible trial and inflicting more harm on an already broken person. Many lawyers can see the bigger picture of the importance of justice. I just don't have the capacity in those particular situations, and so someone else is ethically better for the job. In terms of the personal part of being a lawyer, defending high-profile clients, as in local news coverage, not celebrities, can cause friction with family and friends. I have worked on some cases, not been the lawyer running the case, and had my in-laws so angry that I would defend someone like that. Client confidentiality and the need to keep our defense top secret makes it very hard to explain yourself in those situations. You learn to deal and avoid talking about work, though. Story 17. People view the court system as some sort of competition where the best lawyer wins. Maybe this is the case, maybe not. Instead, view it as two people who have extensive knowledge of the law attacking an issue from both sides until they meet in a fair middle. The courtroom isn't always so binary. If the defense did nothing, the prosecution would absolutely slay the accused and there would be no fair treatment. Story 18. I'm a retired career prosecutor in Ohio. The shoe on the other foot is the horror, the absolute nightmare, at the thought that I may have convicted an innocent person. I put several criminals on the row, but none were ever terminated. The appellate court would find some way to void the penalty. Several times during a trial, I would receive evidence that would make me doubt the defendant's guilt. Case dismissed, just like in My Cousin Vinny. Story 19. I had a criminal law prof who, in his response to this question, mirrored the top comments in this thread, but also said that the only time he ever felt bad about his job is when he was defending a party he believed to be innocent and they got convicted. In that scenario, he didn't just fail them, the entire system did. In the scenario that a guilty person walks free, well, then that's the crown failing. It was an interesting perspective and one I carry with me. Story 20. Guilty is decided in court. Usually your defense attorney really doesn't want to know too much, either that they want just enough information to create doubt, or they want to find a feasible excuse to waive you from harsh punishment. It's really more about providing a service based on a constitutional right than anything else. I don't know any attorneys that revel in setting the cruel criminals of the world free just because they can. Story 21. My criminal law professor, who was also my advisor, explained it like this. It isn't your job to ask if the person is guilty or not. The jury are the fact finders in the courtroom. When you meet with your client, you ask specific, non-incriminating questions to determine what defenses are available to use. If your client begins to incriminate himself, you stop him immediately. If he admits to a crime privately to you, you will then be a witness to perjury during trial if he testifies otherwise. He was a renowned defense attorney in New Jersey who was terminated from the university last year for reasons unknown to us. I suspect it was his unorthodox teaching methods or his short temper. Story 22. Bird lawyer here. Most of the time, it's okay, but the job has been known to ruffle my feathers. Sometimes clients are guilty, this I can deal with, but when they fly off the handle and get aggressive, it gets to me because there's a pecking order. Two can play at that game, I'll say, and maybe I don't necessarily represent them as well as I would have done. To be honest, it's distressing and most of my clients wind up behind bars. Story 23. This is a great question, but I think most of the lawyers answering are kind of deflecting the issue. Whether or not something is right or wrong, whether or not a defendant gets his fair day in court the way everyone deserves, that's what you're there for. How does it feel to defend a client who is guilty? Instead, most of the replies are, it feels great to defend the Constitution, or, I don't know, he's guilty. Then two of the prerequisites of the question aren't being met. Some of the answers are detailed, thought-provoking, and very insightful, but they also don't answer the question that was asked. What if your client was accused of termination? Take the incident of David Westerfield. After the trial, it was reported that his two attorneys, Stephen Feldman and Robert Boyce, told David to plead not guilty despite the fact he was willing to lead the police to the evidence. However, search parties found it before the plea bargain was made. The real question is, how do those attorneys feel to have to defend someone who was about to lead them? Story 24. Not a criminal lawyer, but one of the oldest principles of lawyering and one that remains extant in many jurisdictions is the cab rank principle. It remains the case that for barristers, you cannot turn down a case in your area of expertise if you're free to work and the fee will be reasonable. Criminals normally get legal aid, so for criminal lawyers, money is being paid by the state. Legal representation isn't about winning or losing, it's about doing the best you can for your client. Whether it's a criminal case or a commercial case, the duty of the lawyer is always to the administration of justice and to their client. But yeah, everybody thinks some of their clients are schmucks. Story 25. I'm not practicing, but I've been asked this question a lot. I see a defense lawyer as defending the law rather than the client. They are there to ensure the law is correctly and fairly applied. Without defined lawyers, the law would be so distorted that many innocent people would be convicted. I don't think I could do the job, but I have a lot of respect for those that do that difficult job. Story 26. Most of the skeezy, high-profile attorneys who defend obviously guilty people do so just to get their name out there and subsequently make loads of cash on easy DUI cases and the like. There's a couple guys like that in my hometown who jump on every high-profile case they can. Nothing like free advertising on the front page of the paper. Story 27. In short, horrible. So I was never a criminal attorney nor a trial attorney, so I didn't defend anyone guilty of anything. But I used to be an attorney for a Fortune 5 in corporate America. My job included a great deal of working the loopholes, so to speak. That is, I would either set things up or find things that had been set up in deals with clients, business partners, or even our own employees that were advantages to the company even if they weren't common sense to the deal. So I was never working a defense of the guilty. I was just finding ways to make us, quote, technically correct in our dealings, even if we were pragmatically screwing people over. It's not a rewarding job. There's certainly no sense of having contributed anything particularly helpful to anyone. And in the rare times when you do pin a name or a face of someone who gets hurt by having been outlawed on a technicality, you feel kind of scummy. That's why I ultimately left that line of work. Story 28. There are ethical and evidentiary rules in place that safeguard attorneys from compromising his or her morals. In other words, a lawyer only takes the evidence and facts as given by the client to make their case. That's what the trial process is all about, to sort out fact from fiction. So it's not like you're lying for a person, rather you're acting as an advocate for their side of the story. For example, if a person had grass in their car, but the evidence shows that the arresting officer improperly searched the vehicle for whatever reason, the charge can be acquitted on those grounds even if they were guilty of actually possessing the substance. The rationale is that the freedoms set forth by the Constitution/Bill of Rights were violated, so the evidence of their guilt can't be used to convict. So it's not about how the representing attorney feels about it. It's how the rules and evidence play out. Attorneys are only there to make sure all of the pieces to the puzzle are brought before the trier. That being said, learning the law has a funny way of letting you distance yourself from most guilt you may feel as an attorney. And ethical violations like hiding actual knowledge of incriminating evidence are very bright lines. So if you are doing something improper as an attorney, chances are you will not keep your license for very long. Story 29. I've had to give informal legal assistance to people whose public defenders were so obviously not doing their jobs, even a layman could see it. But the defendant was also guilty as hell by all the evidence stacked against them. All I could do was help make sure the guy got a fair sentence. One of them was a defendant looking at life over a first-time serious crime substance possession charge, because his misdemeanor track record was miles long, it seemed. I knew misdemeanors aren't valid counts towards serious crimes when it comes to marking someone as a career criminal. Pointed that out to him, who he ended up pointing that out to his public defender, and he came out with only 10 years, which, as I understand it, is the minimum. He seemed happy about it, considering he was looking at life beforehand. I can't imagine how many injustices like that go on and don't get caught every day either. Story 30. I find it disturbing that a good lawyer is one who can cause a guilty man to go free. Think of O.J. Simpson and his dream team. They were considered exceptionally good because of past cases where criminals they had represented had been allowed to go unpunished. And of course, those same lawyers lay the blame on the system. It's not their fault that people who are obviously guilty get set free. The lawyers are just using whatever is available to them for the good of their client. Anytime a guilty person gets off the hook, O.J., Casey Anthony, John DeLorean, it's high fives and backslaps for all the lawyers involved. Other lawyers view them as role models. That's one of the reasons so many people despise lawyers. Story 31. This question will only serve as propaganda for your state law society or bar. To answer the question, they don't give a crap. Here are a few lies of omission every lawyer fails to mention. 1. Their oath, duties, obligations, and fealty is to the law society and its protection/interests. Their duty to you is secondary. 2. When you are attorned, that's what an attorney does, you forfeit all rights and become a ward of the court/state. Lawyers here or anyone else who say otherwise are simply lying to you. 3. And this one should be obvious, but nobody mentions it. Win or lose, they still get paid. Guilty? Not guilty? They don't give a crap and never have. Story 32. Well, I know from experience it can be very tough. I had a client a few years ago who was being charged with some pretty serious charges. He hired me, and me and my team began to build his case. The evidence against him was quite overwhelming, but we did everything we could to help win the case. It was the day of his final court date, and would decide if he was to spend years in prison or not. They brought him into the courtroom in shackles and sat him next to me. I thought something looked different about him since I last saw him, but couldn't place it. We waited our turn for his hearing outside the courtroom. I went over what our plea bargain was that I had struck with the DA. He seemed pleased by the offer. After he leaned close to me and said, "Mr. Kilgore, Trout, before we go in, I have to tell you something about the case." I was anxious to see what he would say and hoped it wasn't an admission of guilt, since that would make my job so much harder to do. He looked me in the eyes and said, "But before I tell you, I need you to promise something." I told him I couldn't promise him anything before I heard what he had to say, as it could be unlawful. He told me, "Sir, I just need something from you, that's all." I asked the client what it was that he needed. As the words came out of his mouth, I stepped back away from him in horror. I knew he had seemed off today, and now I knew why. As he spoke, I noticed there were tears in his eyes. "I'm gonna need about $350. Ah, god dang it, Nessie, I ain't giving you no $350, and I suggest you find another lawyer." Story 33. My brother was charged with a Class 3 serious crime a few years back. He was intoxicated, stepped out to get some food from a food truck and had a smoke, tossed a cig in the dumpster, which was a cardboard-only dumpster. About the time he noticed it starting to burn, his two other friends came around the corner to find him. One jumps in to try to stop it out, but to no avail. At this time, a couple of cops round the corner and notice the scene. They arrest all three and call the FD. At the first court date, they basically, as I understood, took the officer's statements and the defendant's statement. The cops said that they saw flames rising from above the rooftops, impossible as these are old German 3-story row buildings, and ran around the corner to find two men laughing while another man danced around in the dumpster lighting boxes on fire. At the second date, the cop adds to his story that he noticed a can of propellant that he witnessed being used, not documented by the FD. My brother's attorney tore the cop to pieces. The charge was eventually dropped to intoxicated mischief or something like that, a misdemeanor. So here's a guy who busted his back getting through college while working full-time, lands a decent job and buys a house after years of crappy jobs and tiny apartments. And if not for good lawyers keeping the system in check, the officer would have ruined his life. Yes, my brother was and still can be an idiot, but he didn't deserve several years of jail for it. And if you liked any of these stories, here's more for you. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. I'll catch you in that video.